I've been in this somewhat lonely journey coming out of the deep bowels of finance. In fact, I used to work just around the corner from here at the, I always refer to it as the old JP Morgan, not to be confused with JP Morgan. And I've been on this journey having kind of learned about the environmental crisis in particular as a systemic issue. In particular, reading Limits to Growth, where the punchline is exponential growth on a finite planet doesn't work. The physics don't allow it. And we have an economic system that is predicated on exponential growth as the source of our prosperity, and a financial system that's wired into ensuring that that happens. And all of those things are working pretty well. Just as designed, we're creating exponential growth and material throughput on a finite planet, and making lots and lots of money, and converting natural capital and social capital into financial capital as a result. So now Steve has this massive pile of money, and how many clients who have a pile of money to manage, and we're destroying the basis of life on this planet. And that's a big problem to solve. And I've been resisting the attempts to solve that problem that are embedded in the sustainability movement for now, probably I learned about this 15 years ago and have been resisting it for over 10 years, which is why I started Capital Institute. So it's kind of a lonely journey. And John's declaration that triple bottom line is not the solution, even though it's vitally important, to me is a kind of a clarion call to all of us in this community that we need to slow down and think deeper before we move fast with our actions. And I'm going to try to share with you in a short amount of time, and I know no one wants to sit here and be lectured at, but kind of the intellectual journey I've been on and where I've come to, which is this idea of regenerative economics. And I use the word capitalism. The proper name should be really regenerative multi-capitalism, to your point, and many people's understanding. But that obviously isn't quite as catchy as regenerative capitalism. Wouldn't work in America, that's for sure. And I'm not even sure anymore that capitalism is a viable idea. And we could debate that. But I come out of the free enterprise system. I like the term free enterprise system. I have huge, passionate belief in the free enterprise system. But I'm not sure that the capitalist system as we understand it today, and even as we are trying to transform it, is a viable option on a fixed planet with 7 billion people going to 10 billion people. So part of my message is I think we need to question the unquestioned assumptions, including, is the stock market at the center of Steve's diagram? Is that really true? Or do we need to have a bigger understanding of what investment means and an understanding of the difference between investment and speculation? And in my mind, the big investors of the world are really nation states, corporations, and billionaires. And if the wealth is concentrated in 0.1% of the population, and certainly 1% of the population, then there's a responsibility to that ownership of that capital, and there's a responsibility to governments who invest massive amounts of capital, as well as massive corporations that are investing capital. And so I think the point is, I think we need to widen our lens a bit and get to, if we want to get to the core of these issues. So in many ways, this is a question of perception. And I know the royal family is having a little bit of a hard time right now. So I want to give a shout out. In all honesty, Prince Charles' book, Harmony. How many people have read Harmony? Not many. So that's fascinating. So we're in the United Kingdom. The prince has written a book which is highly aligned with regenerative capitalism and understands all this stuff much deeper than I certainly would have expected. Has written a book, and I'd highly recommend it to everyone. Einstein once said, theory determines what we're able to see. It's another way of saying this. And if you look to the contemporary economics business or industry, William Nordhaus, how many people know William Nordhaus's work? Do you know he won the Nobel Prize? And do you know the model that he won the Nobel Prize for calculated that the optimal global warming we should shoot for is 3.5 degrees. That's the Nobel Prize, highest peak of our economics profession. You look at me like, he must be kidding. It's true. In fact, excuse me. In fact, the model used to say 4 degrees, but they improved it, so it now says 3.5 degrees. And by 2030, it'll probably say 3 degrees. And you get where I'm going. Here's, to me, the way the financial industry looks at the world. This is the perspective of finance. There's this thing called the planet. It's out there somewhere, and it has natural resources on it that are really valuable to us. It also has all these people on it. And the people we call human resources. So we have natural resources and human resources. And we, sitting on the top of this, all wise, all knowing allocators of capital, decide how to organize natural resources and human resources in such a way to make this economy create economic growth, which is the source of our prosperity. That's the deal, right? That's what we've created. And of course, any sort of 6-year-old would understand that there's something a little bit out of whack with that. And in fact, the reality is that we need a financial system in service to an economy, and an economy that understands that it's embedded in the biosphere and not separate from the biosphere. And that switch is the challenge that's in front of us. And if I knew how to do that, if I was any good at this, we would have been a lot further along in it. But that's the challenge that I'm working on, and that we're all working on, even if we don't know it. Now, a couple more things, just again, getting a little theoretical, and I apologize, but again, if the theory we were using that runs the world actually worked, we wouldn't need to pause and focus on theory. Economics, classical economics, was built on the framework of classical physics. There was physics envy, and the economists said, well, if there's natural laws of physics, we need similar things for economics, so we can be as half as much stature in society as the physicists could. Then we realized that the world is uncertain. And so we brought the mathematicians in. Where's Bob? We brought the mathematicians in, and we laid on top of economics this idea of econometrics or statistics to deal with this uncertainty. Classical physics works really great for single cause and effect things, like an apple falls from a tree because of gravity. Statistics works really well for things that are totally disconnected, like randomly rolling the dice. Well, it turns out that things in the real world are complex, and complex things have intertwined causes. And so our fundamental economics and our fundamental finance models, like value at risk, like modern portfolio theory, are built on a foundation of outdated physics and statistics that are being used in an improper way because the distribution of the things we're trying to measure are not disconnected, they're interconnected. So you wonder why long-term capital crashed in the 90s, because the value at risk models that said there was a 1 in whatever, 10,000 year chance that this would blow up, turned out it blew up. The same thing happened in the financial crisis. Modern portfolio theory, well, I'm not going to digress into that. But the idea of this interconnected causes is that the magic, the beauty of living systems in this planet is that despite all this chaos and interconnected insanity, it produces this incredible, exquisite order. This is actually our planet. That's real data from NASA showing the living planet through the seasons. And the thing is, we're part of that. And the Anthropocene means, as you all know, that we're now actually changing that. So this is like so big. This isn't problem solving. Let's put our analytical brains on problem solving. This is an existential thing that's never happened in the history of this planet, much less the history of humanity. Now that I've scared you. So the first thing is, I think it's important we get clear where we are in the history of humanity. And the way I like to talk about it, and by the way, most things that I'm saying are ideas that I've stolen from other people, but in the interest of time, I won't credit all of them. This is one of those. in the medieval era, the metaphor was God's design. If you want to figure out how to go to heaven, you go to church, they tell you what to do. You do that, you go to heaven. Then the modern age came along. This guy named Copernicus posited that the Earth is actually not the center of the universe, just like the stock market is not the center of the world, but that actually the Earth is rotating around the sun. And that undermined all of the core idea of this God's design, take our marketing instructions when we go to church on Sunday. And of course, the people that put these ideas forward lived a fairly uncomfortable life. Copernicus was afraid to say that, and Galileo spent most of his life in house arrest after he proved it with a telescope. We're at a similar turning point in the evolution of human society. We're shifting out of the modern era. We assume that the modern age is here forever, the end of history. But in fact, it's very clear that all of the things that made all the greatness of the modern age possible, which is largely our reductionist thinking that allows us to figure out what's complicated through analytical reasoning and the scientific method, is proving its limitations. Because when we break things apart that are very complicated into their little parts, we miss things. And we can call that an externality. But when an externality is threatening the very survival of life on this planet, I'd call it more than an externality. So I think we're living in what now people are calling the integral age. It's just that we're at this very beginning part of it. And so we don't realize we've shifted from one age to the other. And the implications of that are profound. And it's affecting not just business and not just finance, but it's affecting every sector of society. So for example, in the healthcare industry, we're now talking about integrated medicine, which is an integration of Western reductionist medicine and Eastern medicine. In education, the big thing is now transdisciplinary education. In agriculture, regenerative agriculture is now at the forefront of thinking, notwithstanding the scientific, I forget the term that we used this morning, but the ability to deconstruct proteins out of milk is not a regenerative agriculture idea, and it's a very fascinating possibility that we need to come back to. Business and banking, economics and finance, I think are all going through this transition from what it means to think in a reductionist way to think in a holistic way. And if you think holistic is some kind of California woo-woo term, keep in mind that it was coined by Jan Smuts, who was a Boer War general in South Africa. And the thing about war is it's similar to its complexity. You can't anticipate things that are going to change. So it turns out both Eisenhower and Jan Smuts were holistic thinkers, and their greatness as military generals is attributed to their holistic thinking. And so holistic thinking is the key to managing in complexity. We can't actually manage or control complexity. We need to learn to work with it, which is a very different paradigm than we're accustomed to thinking. I also want to make the point that regenerative capitalism, regenerative economics, whatever you want to call it, this is not about the left-right socialism, capitalism debate. This sits above it. And my hope is that in the future, we will have liberals and conservatives fighting and arguing about how best to encourage and create policies to support a regenerative economic system. A quick definition, and this is my words, this isn't truth, this is just my latest thinking. Regenerative economics is the application of nature's laws and patterns of systemic health, self-organization, self-renewal, and regenerative vitality to socioeconomic systems. If you're interested to go deeper in this, I did write a paper, sort of a book on this in 2015, and I have a new paper out now called Finance for a Regenerative World, which is where I try to sort of say, well, if regenerative economics or a regenerative economy is the goal, what needs to happen to the financial system to be in service of that outcome? It's all on my website at capitalinstitute.org. One way to think about the evolution of this economic thinking is that neoliberal economics is, and I'm rapidly reducing this to just a few key points, but neoliberal economics is kind of what is the mainstream today. I would describe it as, invisible hand thinking turned into ideology and then applied in a context that no longer makes any sense. Environmental economics, and that context is that, well, I won't even try to go there. environmental economics is how we get the Nobel Prize to award a model that says we should optimize at 3.5 degrees because it'll cost too much to optimize at a lower target temperature. And since economic growth is the source of our prosperity, that's the unquestioned assumption, it must be that we can price the cost of economic growth and we can optimize that with a fairly simplistic model that is not at all dealing with the complexity of living systems. Ecological economics was a massive leap forward in which it introduced the constraint of scale for the first time. And I love the term, instead of environmental quality, we need to focus on environmental quantity. We are out of space on the planet given the technology and scale of the human experiment. And ecological economics is the first evolution of economic thinking that intentionally captures that and tries to build it into the framework. And I think what is left to do to create truly a theory of regenerative economics is to take sort of a leap into the assumption that if the only systems that have sustained themselves on this planet for long periods of time are living systems, I think that's a true assertion, because if they're not here, they're not living systems anymore. And the scientists understand the basic principles and patterns of living systems. And if we humans are living systems, I think that's an assertion we can all agree on, then our human economy will need to either adjust to the patterns and principles that describe the way living systems actually work, or someone's going to need to make the case why the human economy is going to be the only exception to the rule that says that any system that can sustain itself over long periods of time looks like living systems. And by the way, the only human culture that looks like living systems and the only human culture that has sustained itself since the history of humanity are indigenous cultures. So there's something to that. Now, what is a way to grasp what this means? Bill Reed at Regenesis has a beautiful diagram that I use all the time. He works in the built environment, so he's working on real estate development and real estate impact on the planet. And so I've sort of morphed this into, not for real estate, but for the entire economy. I've added a few words and whatnot. But essentially the idea is that we live in this conventional degenerative system, not by design, not because we're bad people, but because we were in a sense ignorant of of how to deal with complexity. It's a mechanistic design. We view the world as a machine and we try to optimize and work the parts. It's reductionist thinking. And sustainability is this sort of nefarious goal we're trying to get to. Ray Anderson used to talk about climbing Mount Sustainability. And so while, again, just as someone earlier this morning said, we'll take incremental change. Incremental change is essential. And most of the work in the sustainability community is incremental change. But incremental change gets harder and harder the closer you get to the top of the mountain. It's kind of like climbing Mount Fuji in a snowstorm. Each step gets steeper and it gets icier. And so I believe the only way we end up with a sustainable system is if we understand that we need to adopt and adjust and embed the regenerative process. And the outcome of the regenerative process is sustainability. So my body is regenerating as I'm standing here, literally at a cellular level. On average, my cells regenerate every 7 years. So do yours. But that allows me to sit here and give a talk and chat after lunch and blah, blah, blah for some long period of time. But that's only possible because my body is working as a living system. And so if that's true for my body, if that's true for the entire planet Earth, why wouldn't that be true for the human economy? Easier said than done. If I knew how to do this, I would give you the menu and we can all get to work. I don't know how to do this. But what I do believe is that there are clear patterns and principles that describe how this works. And I've tried to reduce these. Notice the word reduce, that's reductionist thinking. So one thing we need to do is constantly be aware of when we're flipping from holistic thinking back to reductionist thinking, because we are not smart enough to get our heads around all this at one time. So trying to reduce this to the least number of principles, or you could even think of them as qualities, of a regenerative system that I could think of and integrate them into a context that makes sense for a human economy, I came up with these 8. And I don't really have time to go through them. There's lots in the paper, but let me just talk about one of them, or 2 of them. So in-right relationship, the idea of symbiotic relationship, all of the component parts in our body have to work symbiotically with each other. Let's go back to finance and capital markets. In our pursuit of efficiency, in that case, the efficiency of the return on capital invested, we've separated 2 really critical components of our economy, owners and enterprises. And they've been separated through an institution called the public capital markets. And so now we debate whether it's the asset owners or the fund managers who's responsible, but in reality, the only person responsible for a building to make sure the roof doesn't leak is the owner, right? If the owner doesn't do it, or the regulators don't tell them to do it, but ultimately the owner has to do it. But we've created a system where ownership has been divorced and separated from enterprise decision-making through this well-intended thing called our capital markets. And until we see that that's the core problem, and I'm radically simplifying it, I would argue that all of the ESG in the world and all of the transparency in the world is not going to actually change that outcome. And I'll give you a quick anecdote since we're picking on BlackRock already. A friend of mine is a director of one of the big New York banks, and he had his annual visit from the BlackRock ESG analyst. And they went, she's very articulate, very bright, had all kinds of good ideas. I'm sure she had some influence on his thinking. But he said to me, it was sort of surreal because she knew and I knew that they were never going to sell our stock because we're in the index. And so there was this sort of, we spent an hour talking about it, and then we shook hands and went our ways, and we know we'd meet again in a year, but that's not the responsibility that goes with ownership we need. If you want to see responsibility that goes with ownership, look at what activist hedge funds do. They take responsibility for stuff. Now, we may not like how they choose to act, but that's a very different model of ownership and governance than what's possible through a 1.5% position as a passive index investor in a company. Solutions for that are complicated. Sorry, one more point on this. Another thing about living systems is that they exist in place. So again, playing on this idea of shifting to a more decentralized local approach. Living systems happen or human living systems happen where human culture and geology connect, and that's in place. So the principles would tell us that yes, we actually need to move toward organizing ourselves in a more decentralized way. And that's why this idea of bioregionalism, I think, is so powerful. Again, as I mentioned, I did write a whole long paper, it's really a book as well, on applying these ideas to finance. And I put the movement of sustainable finance on that same spectrum. Ultimately, we move into what I'm calling integral capital, and ultimately something I'm calling systemic philanthropy, and that needs a new word. But that gets to this idea that we have created this massive pile of financial capital, and we have a massive shortage now of natural capital and social capital. And the challenge in front of us is to figure out how to reinvest, redirect, re-embed that financial capital back into our social and ecological systems. And that's the challenge of this century, not just decade. I do this in my own investment practice. I don't use modern portfolio theory. I'm happy to share with people what my own portfolio looks like. I think of it conceptually like this. I want it to be responsible. Resiliency is the watchword in these turbulent times ahead, so I'm very focused on owning resilient cash flows. I don't think about sectors as much as resilient cash flows. Of course, I want them to be responsible, but ultimately I try to have it invested in projects that are moving us toward a regenerative way. And I'm seeing I'm running short on time, so I'm going to go quickly. Can this decade be a regenerative decade? Obviously, this is huge, and it has to happen at an individual level first. It has to happen in every organization, every investor, every government. And again, as I mentioned earlier, I think it happens grounded in bioregional approaches. One quick example is work that I do with a group called Alan Savory in holistic management of the grasslands. What you see in the picture on the left is conventionally managed cows. What you see on the right is holistically managed cows. The industrial feedlot system is a disaster. I'm not talking about that. But we know that we can sequester carbon to reduce this to carbon by managing the way we manage on the right as opposed to managing on the left. And it turns out that a farm has had this validated, white oak pastures, and it is a net carbon sink even though it's managing herds of cattle. Look how much better that is than the Impossible Burger, which is still an emitter of greenhouse gases, notwithstanding any of the issues about whether it's actually good for our human health to eat an Impossible Burger. Now, in terms of an example of how this works on one of the 8 principles is what I call the edge effect. In living systems, diversity and innovation happens at edges. So this same Savory Institute has a global network of regenerative ranching, and working with both the fashion industry and the meat industry, we're able to create value. The key to the whole idea of pursuing a regenerative approach and a regenerative model is that it unlocks potential that we don't otherwise see. And that potential has to be the source of our future prosperity if we're cut off from continuing exponential growth as a source of our prosperity. And it turns out in this case that if you manage animals holistically, you sequester carbon, and if you have the food industry and the fashion industry working together, you can optimize the economics of this in such a way that everyone wins. Eileen Fisher has this on their website. That's how they're marketing it. We at Capital Institute have launched a global network called the Regenerative Communities Network, again, following our belief that this has to happen at a bioregional scale. There's huge efforts and initiatives, thousands going on at a bioregional scale around the world. It's just invisible. And I think one of the challenges for business is to figure out how they become in membership with those bioregional initiatives as opposed to seeing themselves as a top-down organization where the walls of the firm are the walls that they're responsible for. No, they're actually members of all of these bioregional communities in which they operate. I love the visual of John's new book. And I believe that an exponential growth of these bioregional initiatives that are doing regenerative work is essentially what the new regenerative economy is going to look like. And the challenge for business and the challenge for finance is to figure out how to participate in that and not necessarily think it has to lead it, because it's amazing what's happening at a grassroots level. People understand what to do. They just need the power and resources of the business community to participate with that. Finally, a quote from Bucky Fuller. As I mentioned earlier, I don't think any of my thinking is really new thinking. It's more a synthesis of old ideas. Bucky Fuller wrote a book, his final book in 1983. It was published the year he died. And he says that nature is a totally efficient, self-regenerating system. I didn't know that until about a year ago. So the point is that this is nothing new. We've understood this. It's just that we don't see the world through the lens of living systems. And if we did, we would be, in much better case to know how to act. And so my plea to us all is, in our urgency in the 2020s to act, we slow down long enough to get clear on which technologies we want to use, how we want to use those technologies. And my challenge to us all is, if you have a better idea on how to organize a system to be sustainable than the 4.5 billion year proof of this planet, step right up. But I think we need to be a bit humble and say that's a pretty good bet on the answer to that question, and figure out not how to fix our problems, but figure out how to transition our human economy into a system that looks like and behaves like and unlocks the potential of living systems. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Just some questions by Mentimeter, but we want to get you to lunch as well. So.
Yeah, so we have, thank you everyone for submitting questions. We have way more than we can possibly get to, but I just wanted to call out a couple of themes and maybe get you to respond. One is, so a few people have asked about your slide showing the evolution from neoliberal economics through to regenerative economics, and particularly the distinction between ecological economics and regenerative economics, and how that's different. And someone also referenced donut economics as another term or model that's out there, and what the relationship is there. So that's one kind of clarification type question. And then several people have asked questions that kind of get to this idea of systems leadership, systems thinking, holistic thinking, and any ideas or tips you have on, how do you become a more effective holistic thinker? Where does systems leadership come from? And even as a slight sidebar to that, any thoughts on the potential of AI as an enabler of systems thinking?
Okay. So Herman Daly, who is the founder of ecological economics, is one of my intellectual heroes. I was part of an effort to nominate him for the Nobel Prize. So I am indebted I am indebted to Herman, and I'm trying to build on the foundation of his really path-breaking work. If I were to critique ecological economics, and I'm not the only one who does this, it would be that it's sort of stopped short, or it stopped moving forward and shifted into this whole effort to value ecosystem services. And that's figuring out how to put a price on ecosystem services is trying to fit that paradigm back into neoliberalism. So since our system is organized around money, we need to translate everything into money. Well, simple example, the agricultural industry in the United States is something like 1% of GDP, maybe 2%. It's trivial. But the agriculture system is destroying the planet. So how is it that we can sort of dismiss it because it's a small number if it's literally destroying the planet? So shifting everything into money simply doesn't work. As another teacher of mine, Peter Brown, likes to say, there's a difference between a cost that you can fix with money and a wrong that you never can. So I think ecological economics is an unfinished experiment, and I want to be more explicit and say we are taking a bet that we need to shift into alignment with living systems principles, period. Donut economics is highly aligned with this. Kate's a friend, a colleague. The main thing about the donut is it visualizes what the goal where we need to get to. And I'm in complete alignment and agreement with that. I tend to be more kind of radical and passionate about the shift to a principles-based approach, because I don't think we're smart enough to understand complexity without clear first principles. And that would be my answer to the technology, whether it's AI or proteins, blah, blah, blah. I was one of the young whippersnappers around the corner doing derivatives, thinking I was so smart and reinventing finance. And I was. And then it went horribly wrong. And that tends to be the history of technological innovation. I would argue the reason for that is that we don't have a framework within which to think about which technologies we want to use. The internet is a beautiful technology. It aligns with the principle of robust circulation. The circular economy is about the circulation of energy and materials. The internet enables the circulation of information and even empathy when you start circulating photographs. But if you layer on top of that a business model that's designed to accelerate addiction and consumption and misinformation, then you're in violation of all the principles of living systems. So the internet is brilliant. Social media, the way it's practiced, is a disaster. Derivatives was brilliant. And by the way, Peter Hancock, my colleague at Morgan, who ran AIG after he left Morgan, he's working on a forward curve for climate costs, and wants there to be a listed market for this so that people can start pricing it and then trading it and then doing things that actually can be hedged against that forward curve. So you're right on target. God bless them. I mean, it's but in AI, if we're going to do this at a bioregional level, we need validated, accurate, trustworthy information about whether it's working. Ecological verification. Lots of people are using AI for that purpose. Lots of people are using AI for very other purposes. And so it's not a question of AI. It's a question of our values and the way we see the world.